Okay, so I'm assuming that I know certainly 2A did not get quite as far, and I'm assuming that that's probably going to hold true for 4A and 4B as well, as far as finishing up the segregation in the South part. So I'm going to go ahead and record this. I'm going to try to keep an eye on time because I want you to be able to finish this up. So I'm just going to lecture as though I'm here with you, even though I'm not. So when we finished up in the previous class, we had looked at the Plessy v. Ferguson documents, and you should have come away with a real sense for, um, how segregation was being justified, and really kind of the impact of Jim Crow segregation in the South. And you should also come away with the idea that not everybody kind of bought into the reasoning. But at the same time, you have this system that gets put into place. And your cotton tenants reading definitely kind of reinforces that there's a difference in the way people are treated. Is in that blacks are not given the same opportunities. They're not allowed to partake of the same opportunities even. And this kind of creates still that continuing lack of opportunity that even Thomas Jefferson recognized, if you remember from the Plessy v. Ferguson documents, that blacks had not been given the exact same opportunity that they should have been given. And so that kind of takes us to like the 1896 period. And so really by the time you get to 1896, you have the solidification of the separation of races, and really the implied and kind of almost legal inequality of blacks in social circumstances. One of the things that you should see is that, why is this not turning? There we go. Is that violence is often kind of used to restrain people that would challenge segregation. And we saw this with slavery. We saw this with 12 Years a Slave. That violence is often used to intimidate people and kind of hold them in check. And that's absolutely what happens in the South with as far as lynching is concerned, and it being a form of social control. Economic activities definitely dictate the prevalence of lynching. And you kind of get that sense from the cotton tenants reading that when economically everything's okay, when no one's really challenging the economic system, then typically there's a little more tolerance for unusual behavior. But if you really begin to threaten the economic well-being of the wealthy, or even the economic status of less wealthy individuals, this is where you start to run into a problem. And so there were sociological studies that were done that instances of racial violence increased when you had a bad growing season, when you had a factory laying off people or something like that. So there's a direct tie-in to economics and the threat of economic well-being. And so just kind of connect those two things. And really, in a lot of ways, we talked about this when we talked about slavery, that violence against slaves was used really as an economic motivation because they're trying to increase efficiency. So violence is still used in very much the same way that it was used before. It just manifests itself a little bit different. It's a little more random. I think I mentioned before it's a little more terroristic. And there's certainly kind of this mob mentality rather than having, one slave owner that whips his slaves and another slave owner that doesn't. Now you seem to have kind of this culpability of the entire community. And there's a lot of tensions that come, because of this violence. And anyone that really threatens to change the system. And it's important that you understand this violence exists. It never really goes away, right? I mean, you have flare-ups. During Reconstruction, you have a lot more KKK violence. And then as Redeemer Democrats come in, that kind of fades to the background. And then whenever you would have, this economic crisis, you would tend to have flare-ups of violence. And during the 1920s, when society is undergoing a great deal of changes, you have another flare-up of violence. During the civil rights movement, when people really feel like the system is being challenged, there's another flare-up of violence. So violence is constantly simmering in the background, and it never quite goes away. And I think you need to understand that. And of course, I've included a gruesome picture of a lynching, because you need to understand that these were real people and it was real crime, and that you would have people, they would sell tickets to go watch somebody be hung. And that history, guys, is right here in Texas. Sulphur Springs is one, Greenville's another one. That have documented cases in the 20th century of basically where people would travel to go watch them lynch somebody that had been accused of, something, a black man that had been accused of something. So I think it's very important for you to kind of grasp that violence was very much there. If we had more time, we would go into that in a little more detail, because I think you should understand just how prevalent it was in the South and in Texas in particular. One of the people that really one of the issues is to end lynching, right? This is a hot button issue for the black community throughout the late 1800s into the 20th century. Ida B. Wells is the main, she's a female journalist. She's the one who does a lot of the sociological studies that says that it was often economically motivated. And she's the one that continuously puts anti-lynching kind of as one of those things that we really have got to take care of. Now, keep in mind, we don't actually outlaw lynching until like the 1940s. And one could argue that it wasn't until, what was it, Clinton, or maybe it was Bush 43, that we have the hate crime legislation that really toughened up the consequences for anything that is labeled a hate crime. So it's really not until at least the very end or the very beginning, around the turn of our current century, that we really finally have the response that somebody like Ida B. Wells would have wanted, that we really challenged what segregation or what lynching was all about. And so just kind of, that's a name you need to recognize. Sometimes she pops up on the STAR test. The next response that I want you to be aware of is Booker T. Washington. In 1895, he gives a famous speech called the Atlanta Compromise speech. And in that, he's giving this speech where he essentially says that blacks should not be advocating for political equality. Now, remember what I've told you about kind of the fact that you had political equality thanks to Reconstruction. Reconstruction was not about social and economic equality. It was about political equality. And that after, with the Compromise of 1877, that equality goes away. And you have blacks really for about 20 years trying to find a way to achieve political equality once again. And so this has been a topic that would have been talked about certainly among the black community, but also among white community as well. People that were concerned about maintaining peace and that kind of thing. And one of the readings that you'll have over this coming weekend is over the creation of the New South, and you only have to read selections of it, right? So basically, this New South kind of proposes that we don't really have any racial issues, except you've got blacks that are saying, wait a minute, we aren't getting the chance to vote. And so people are very uncomfortable with this conversation about the lack of political activity in the 1880s and 1890s. So Booker T. Washington, who was a former slave himself, is trained in kind of and educated, right? And he manages to get together some support and creates the Tuskegee Institute. And the Tuskegee Institute is basically a vocational school. Yes, it does teach blacks how to read and how to do basic math, but its primary goal is for blacks to be gainfully employed. The idea is not that they have to be college educated, but that they just need to have enough education to have a job. And so he basically advocates for this idea of, focusing on education and economic opportunity. And why do we have to worry about, why are we agitating for political equality when that seems to upset people? What difference does it make if you have a vote if you can't feed your family? And so the emphasis for Booker T. Washington is on economic security for the black community. And some people would say, and I misspelled accommodation there, some people would say that that Booker T. Washington is accommodating Jim Crow segregation. And certainly this criticism is definitely there with his contemporaries. It's also there among historians. You have people that basically look at Booker T. Washington and say that his assertion that blacks did not need the right to vote, that they could be happy with just having a job, is really setting the bar very low. He doesn't seem to care about the self-determination of blacks. And one of the problems with Booker T. Washington is that he will ultimately really kind of hoard his position as kind of a black civil leader. And he really becomes the go-to guy. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt invites Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner. Booker T. Washington kind of, hoards all the donations meant to help, educate blacks and that kind of thing, which, I mean, this whole idea of paternalism still kind of exists there. And Booker T kind of sees himself as being the avenue of kind of this paternalism, that he's like, people give him the money and he distributes it to those he sees worthwhile. He was known for chasing out or for encouraging people not to help or not to advertise, not to support black newspapers that were critical of his accommodationist goals. So his Atlanta Compromise speech is controversial for black historians, but it's also, it's hard to know how to feel about it. On one hand, Booker T creates the Tuskegee Institute, and the Tuskegee Institute is very much an important development for the black community. I mean, it provides education, it provides an avenue to economic opportunity. You begin to see a thriving middle class, and Booker T certainly argues that economic equality is significantly important. That what blacks needed to do was not fight for the chance to vote, but rather to have the same economic chances that everybody else has. Just let us work for $1, and we'll show you that we can earn the right to vote. And to some extent, he's not entirely wrong. Now, the problem is he's suggesting that the entire black experience can be summed up in his experience. And, of course, the one thing I think we know in the 21st century is that, sometimes, I mean, people are different and people do different things. Yes, you can come get them. So people do different things based on their interests and what their goals are, and that we shouldn't limit people based on our perceptions of what they're capable of. And Booker T. Washington, for all that he does some really great things, he also does some things that can be criticized. So just understand that Booker T. Washington is a little bit of a problematic figure for black historians because of that, because he talks about accommodation. And this is something that will get thrown at many black activists that are perceived as working too much with the systems that are oppressing blacks. And so this is kind of a taint, and we'll talk about this some more when we get to the civil rights movement and we talk about Martin Luther King and the accusation he has to deal with. We're coming up on Martin Luther King Day. He gets accused of being too accommodationist, of working too much with white society and not advocating for enough radical action. And I don't know that that's a fair criticism if you really study Martin Luther King's life and the actions that he took. But it definitely gets leveled at people periodically. And the originator of kind of this criticism is Booker T. Washington, because he's the one that was perceived as an accommodationist, that he worked with Jim Crow segregation. White society loved his message. because they liked thinking that, well, all they have to do is get a job. It's very much the same attitude we have now towards the poor in general. Well, they just need to get off welfare, and they just need to go get a job, and then they'll just work their way up. And that's true. It's not that that's not true. It's that there's a lot more to that problem than just that one simplistic response. And Booker T. Washington definitely kind of embodied just kind of one aspect of the black struggle after the Civil War, and trying to negotiate this world where, Reconstruction has stopped, and in fact gone backwards in a lot of ways, thanks to Jim Crow segregation and the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling that has essentially limited opportunity for blacks in all kinds of places. So I wanted you to be somewhat familiar with his argument. The other side of this is going to be W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois is kind of like the opposite side of Booker T. Washington. Du Bois feels that blacks should have political rights first and foremost. They should be able to vote. That it doesn't do you any good to earn a dollar if you can't protect that dollar by choosing who you vote for. And he's the first black person to get a PhD. He attended Harvard. This is a highly intellectual, highly intelligent person, and he was a sociologist and studied basically race relations in the United States in the late 1800s. Had been educated in Germany. I mean, so he's a very kind of unique person, and he starts studying race relations, and he witnesses a race riot in the city of Atlanta. And this really kind of shakes him up, and he begins to have a real sense of it's not going to matter what we do. Racism is too ingrained, and that what we have to do is take control of the ballot box and really kind of shape the political system, and that's the only way that we're going to be able to effectively cause change. And so he really starts talking about, he talks also about education. He's a huge advocate for college education for blacks. In fact, he believes that vocational training is fine and well and good. He's not necessarily opposed to the Tuskegee Institute, but he definitely believes that the most intellectual of any community needed to be college educated, and that those people would go off and be college educated. And for blacks in particular, they should come back to their communities and then help educate and lift up the other people in their community. So he kind of challenges this accommodation, and that he essentially says that, blacks should be able to reach as far as they want to reach, educationally, politically, economically. There should be no limitations on who they are and what they can become. And a key part of his message is that they need political rights. They have to be able to protect their liberties by going to vote. And if you consider that in light of the voting restrictions that have been passed in the late 1800s with the property taxes and poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses and all that kind of stuff, you can definitely see why he would be saying that. So he argues for activism. He argues that blacks should be very active in agitating for change and insisting upon having the right to vote and trying to change the structures, not necessarily working within them. And so his response is very different from Booker T. Washington. And he and Booker T. have a real kind of, you could say, we'd call it a Twitter war now, except back then it was like kind of letters to the editor. They have a real kind of heated exchange. They don't really care for each other. In fact, there's some accusation that Booker T. Washington tried to silence Du Bois' message by coming after every newspaper that, Du Bois would try to publish in or anything like that. And so there is some criticism there. Du Bois will be a founding member of what we call the Niagara Movement, which is a movement of blacks and whites that get together. They form the Niagara Movement in 1906, I think it is, or 1908, to essentially begin to come up with a plan for how can we achieve political equality. This is where we are in 1908, so how are we going to fix this? The Niagara Movement will later become the NAACP. the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, that of course advocates for the end of segregation and political rights and that kind of thing. So he is a founding member of that organization. So you can kind of get a sense for how Du Bois felt as opposed to how Booker T. Washington felt. And these are the two main black leaders you need to be familiar with. You need to recognize their names. They come up on the STAR test. You also need to recognize their names if you're going to be a politically aware person, because these are, if you're talking about a group of people that are struggling to be heard politically, these guys kind of are the beginning of kind of political activism or educational activism and that kind of thing. So there's a whole lot more to their story than I'm touching on here. The big thing was that I wanted you to understand their names, and I wanted you to understand the difference of their viewpoints, and that their viewpoints are a direct response to this world that's been created after Reconstruction. The world of Jim Crow segregation, the world of sharecropping, and that kind of thing. To kind of close with this section, I wanted to touch on the idea of the lost cause. And this painting right here kind of shows you that Confederate soldier who's come home to a house that's been destroyed. And you saw that clip that we watched from Gone with the Wind. And there's definitely this message that the South was taken advantage of. Oh, excuse me. That the South somehow didn't deserve to be treated the way they were treated after the Civil War. And, I'll just kind of lay it there and let you guys think for yourselves and decide how you feel about it. We've talked, going back to the fall semester, we talked about kind of the buildup and kind of the hardening of lines and the misunderstandings that happen that lead to the Civil War and lead to kind of the circumstance where people, where you have states seceding and trying to create their own country. We read 12 Years a Slave. You know what the slave system was like. And we've talked about the process of Reconstruction and the resistance to changing the Southern society. And understand that Reconstruction was never about promoting social equality. The idea was always that blacks would have to earn their own social position. Economically, they would have to earn their own economic position. Really, Reconstruction was only about politics. So in a lot of ways, Reconstruction focuses on the same notion that W.E.B. Du Bois focuses on, which is going to be this idea that, that political rights are the key to everything else. And certainly if you think back to the Revolution and our Founding Fathers and the Declaration of Independence, what they argued about, their idea of actual representation, hinges on this idea that political activity is where it all comes from, right? And so I think that Reconstruction was in many ways attempting to be true to the spirit of the Founding Fathers, and this idea that you should be able to vote for who you want and you should be able to have a say in your government. Obviously, this is a complicated issue, and the manifestations of political activity and the role of government, these things become much more complicated with every passing year. But the remaking of Reconstruction, the remaking of what the South stood for, I think is something that you need to be aware of, because this is why we study history. We study history so that we can understand what really happened, so that we can have an understanding of essentially that, that the people that write the history books shape opinions over a long period of time, and that having authentic and true history, to having a variety of interpretations. Yes, historians always have a bias. That's not going to disappear. But you have to recognize that there is truth underneath the history. And so the lost cause myth does have elements of truth to it, in that you had a lot of poor whites that came back from the Civil War to destruction, had to rebuild, that were incredibly vulnerable, absolutely. The myth of the carpetbagger, the myth of Reconstruction as being kind of this evil entity. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, in my humble opinion. But you can kind of interpret that for yourself. And how does Reconstruction succeed and fail? I mean, I think that these are good questions that we should take with us. I mean, we're dealing with a 21st century that still struggles with this idea about political participation. Who gets to vote, who doesn't, how are districts drawn, how, are there voter ID laws? We still deal with this question about political participation, and we're still asking the question about political participation in light of economic and social equality. So we still talk about these things. So understanding how it was done in the late 1800s, understanding the Black experience, I think helps us understand the issues that we're currently facing now. And so the Cotton Tenets reading should help you get a good grasp. While it is written in the 1930s, it definitely kind of gives you an idea for how stuck the South remained in spite of Reconstruction. And so I hope that maybe this kind of gives you a different picture. So don't forget what we've talked about as far as the Black experience. I've really kind of condensed, 50 years of Black experience into, 14 slides, which isn't really fair, but I don't want you to forget that you have these alternative views between Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, that you have the simmering violence, that you have a lot of members of the Black community whose names we don't know, that were active at the local level, that tried to create opportunity, that tried to improve education, that tried to expand everything for Blacks to make things better. So just kind of keep that in mind. Next week, I'm not even going to try to start the Move West PowerPoint. So I'll be doing that next week when we come in. So be sure that you read the documents after I've lectured. Hopefully they'll make a little more sense. And I'll try to get the discussion board posted this weekend. So you might check back on Sunday, or I'll send out a reminder, something like that. Don't forget the discussion board is due at midnight tonight. So you need to have that done based on Cotton Tenets. I think that's a pretty straightforward discussion board. And then over the course of the weekend, you probably ought to look at the marginal groups reading that's in eCampus. Again, you only have to read, you read the part on the American West, but then there's sections like on the New South and Frederick Jackson Turner's reading that I have highlighted sections. So if you see highlighted sections, that's what you absolutely have to read. The shorter readings, the one about, you've got Emma Lazarus's poem, you've got the Dawes Act reading, those you can kind of read over. I want you to familiarize yourself with some of the key documents from this period. That kind of helps define what these marginalized groups. I'm going to talk about the Move West in a broad sense, and we'll touch specifically on American Indians, but I also want you to be familiar with specifically with marginal groups, because these are the ones that often get kind of brushed aside in the whole story of looking at Western migration and that kind of thing. So that's what you have to do for the weekend. Nothing too much or too heavy. And I think that's pretty much it. So I will see you guys on Tuesday, B-Day, and then on Wednesday, A-Day. And then we'll finish up the Move West next week. And maybe, if we're lucky, start the Gilded Age. And so I think that's pretty much it. Y'all have a good weekend.